Hi, my name is Bill Polonsky. I'm a diabetes psychologist. I'm on the faculty at the University of California at San Diego, and I'm president of the Behavioral Diabetes Institute. And over the past 30 plus years that I've been working in diabetes, I've had a chance to meet so many people struggling with different aspects of living with diabetes every day. And one of them has been the shame and blame that are just so common. So what we want to do is take a look at this problem that happens all the time and how we can address it. So first of all, let's look at some comments that we hear all the time from folks. For example, one person said this, well, you know, my doctor has told me that I just need to eat less and exercise more. Yeah, sounds so easy when he says it. And I start out every day doing okay, but then I overeat late at night when I'm alone, every night. And then I eat a lot. I'm so embarrassed and so ashamed. Let's look at someone else who said this, you know, I just learned that I now have early kidney disease. I guess I wasn't trying hard enough. And diabetes was so easy to put on the back burner. So now I'm kicking myself. And it's probably too late. I just want to crawl in a big hole and never come back out. And here's someone else who said this. You know, there's plenty of type 2 diabetes all over my family. And now, as a few months ago, it's my turn. I'm 44 and I just feel like a failure. I feel like it's all my fault. I'm taking insulin now and I'm 50 pounds overweight. Even if I lose it, I'm told that I'll always need insulin. People think so badly of type 2ers like me. Sometimes I just want to hide it. Other times I want to say, it isn't all my fault, but is it? So the reason I brought these three common stories of folks I wanted you to hear about is because these are so very common. And they bring us to the theme that we want to talk about today, which is all the shaming and blaming that goes on with diabetes, especially type 2 diabetes. People do it to themselves. People do this shaming and blaming to others. And we see all the different forms of it that happen. We know that people with type 2 diabetes often blame themselves for developing diabetes, for being too heavy, for being unable to lose weight, for having terribly high blood sugars or seemingly terribly high blood sugars, for having to start insulin. Maybe they've developed long-term complications, blaming themselves for not trying hard enough or not having enough willpower. But this goes on and on and on. All this shaming and blaming that people do to themselves and that often loved ones, partners, family members, coworkers do to the individual. And this is terrible because it leads to people feeling pretty down and depressed. I mean, who wants all to be shamed and blamed all the time? Feeling helpless and hopeless. And of course, another result is oftentimes you just become very private and secretive and you want to hide your diabetes from others, especially if the only comments you're getting is not help, but just, again, blame and guilt-inducing statements. And finally, there's a tendency for many folks, if they're feeling ashamed and embarrassed and blamed and beaten down about their diabetes, just to say, I'm going to skip my diabetes. I'm going to neglect my own diabetes care. I just don't even want to think about it because I'm tired of feeling so bad about this. So we've learned a lot about why this happens and why this is so very common. We know that sometimes it's because of, well-meaning healthcare providers who, even though they're trying to help, will say things like, Mr. Smith, if you don't start taking better care of yourself, you're going to end up on insulin. Or, Mrs. Jones, if you want to avoid diabetes, you just need to start eating better and exercising more. And again, well-intentioned, designed to be helpful advice, but there is this sense that you're messing up, you're screwing up, and you need to take better care of yourself, that somehow it really is all up to you and all your fault. And that's where things become a little unclear and, again, leads to people just feeling terrible and unnecessary. So sometimes it's well-meaning healthcare providers, sometimes it's just family and friends. And as many of you know, we have a special term for family and friends and coworkers who have decided that they want to help you manage your diabetes, whether you like it or not, when they become kind of nags about the fact that you should be taking better care of yourself. And we call those people the diabetes police. And again, we understand that almost all the time, when family members and friends and coworkers are acting like diabetes police, they're well-intentioned. They mean well, but again, so much of what often they're saying, all this nagging, is really about blaming you for not doing better. And, well, that almost never helps. And sometimes it isn't even from sources like healthcare providers or family and friends. It's just comments out there in the world, how people generally think about type 2 diabetes in our society. Here's a comment from actually a politician from a number of years ago. You may remember hearing about this. It was about 4 years ago, where this was President Trump's budget chief who, in talking about healthcare insurance, said this: we have plenty of money to provide that safety net so that if you get cancer, you don't end up broke. But that doesn't mean we should take care of the person who sits at home, eats poorly, and gets diabetes. Right? So the idea is that if you've developed type 2 diabetes, you're sort of a lazy, undisciplined idiot, and it's all your fault. Now, that's wrong, by the way, but it's a common way we think about type 2 diabetes. And by the way, we don't tend to think about people who develop other healthcare conditions in the same way. We don't blame people if they develop, rheumatoid arthritis or cancer. We don't say, well, I guess you really were messing up there. But somehow we think it's okay when it comes to type 2 diabetes. That's crazy. And it also doesn't fit the evidence whatsoever, as we'll talk about in a few moments. But what it does do is it leads to people feeling terrible, of feeling embarrassed, feeling ashamed, like you saw in those quotes that I read earlier. And it leads to people, avoiding, becoming secretive, and maybe even backing off from their own diabetes care. So we've got to do something about that, and that's why I'm talking to you today. So I want to talk to you about 4 solutions that we've discovered that can make a difference. So the first one, and probably the most important one, is it's important to get the facts, to know the real facts about this, so that some of this shaming and blaming can go away. And so the most important fact, of course, is we want to mention this, which is that the evidence is clear. It is not your fault that you develop type 2 diabetes. It is not your fault that you struggle with your weight, or that you've just learned, or someday you may learn, that you need to take insulin, or that even you develop long-term complications. Now, you may play some role in this, but let's be clear. No one chooses to wake up in the morning and decide, I think I feel like developing type 2 diabetes. Nobody. So we want to think about some of the real major contributors to this. And there really are 2 external forces. And we don't talk about these enough because there's a tendency for, especially us as Americans, to think, well, everything that happens to me, it's all because of what I do. But we forget there's these powerful, often invisible external forces that play a big role in what happens to us over the course of time. So when it comes to type 2 diabetes, one of those important factors is your genes, right? So if you have close family members, especially parents, who've had type 2 diabetes, it dramatically increases your risk for also developing type 2 diabetes. And this is, again, not have anything to do with whether you're a good or bad person. This is due to your family inheritance. Now, the other major factor is, of course, our American environment. And one of the most remarkable things about our American environment now, as you think about our, food supply, is that it's almost like we're living in this giant feedlot, sometimes what we like to think of as a finishing lot or finishing yard, which is when the cattle are brought to market. And before they're slaughtered, they're brought to this small little area where they're overfed and they're kept so close together, there's little opportunity for any kind of physical activity or exercise at all. And that kind of describes us as Americans. And it doesn't mean we can't fight back against this, but let's be fair. We know Americans have been getting heavier and heavier and heavier over the years. And to a large degree, it's, again, not because we're lazy or idiots, but because we are an overfed society, where we know portion sizes are so large when we eat out in restaurants, or even larger when we look at what we see in cookbooks where the portion sizes are larger. And when we look at the kinds of foods that are easiest and most convenient for us to consume. Again, it doesn't mean we're hopeless, but these invisible external forces, your genes and the environment, have played an enormous role why we've seen this explosion in type 2 diabetes in America and around the world. And this doesn't mean that any of us are helpless, because starting right now, your actions can make a positive difference. So we don't want to discount that, but we want to understand that the development of type 2 diabetes, struggles so many people have with their weight, are not completely because they didn't have enough self-discipline, didn't have enough willpower. There's all these other effects that are things that are happening around us. So let's give ourselves a little bit of, credit for that, take a little bit of the blame and shame off, and now think about what you can do about that. That's what's going to be critical. So that's probably the most important fact I want to mention. The second solution, remember there's 4 of them, is remember that you're not alone. And what I mean by that is this. If you're feeling and have gone through times of feeling embarrassed or ashamed about diabetes, our studies suggest you're in the majority of people with type 2 diabetes in this country. That because of all these things I've discussed that are going on, it's really common to feel this way. I mean, it's terrible. We want to do something about this, but it's very common. And remember, if you're feeling ashamed that you developed type 2 diabetes, more than 10% of Americans also have type 2 diabetes. So next time you're in a room with 10 people or 20 people, odds are good there's somebody else there who has diabetes as well. And remember also that if you're struggling with your weight, and maybe that's a contribution to your type 2 diabetes, you're also far from alone. Again, the majority of Americans are overweight or obese. And when I say the majority, again, that's more than 2/3. So remember, you're kind of weird in America if you're not overweight or obese. It often looks like, when you look at how heavy Americans have gotten over the years, it looks like almost everybody's almost trying to develop, putting themselves at risk for the development of type 2 diabetes. But most of those people who actually struggle with their weight in America, they never develop diabetes. They, quote unquote, fail to develop diabetes. Why? Because they just don't have the genes. Again, it's the genes and the American environment. So feeling embarrassed, struggling with your weight, having developed diabetes, you're not alone. And remember also, if you're struggling every day with trying to get your blood sugars into a safe range to make those target goals, you're also not alone about that. Here's the most recent evidence from a national database where we see that 28% of people with diabetes in this country, and this is primarily type 2 diabetes. I'm sorry for the complications on this slide. There's a lot here, but I want you to pay attention just to that small purple bar on the far right. Because basically what that shows us is that 28% of people with diabetes in this country are reaching ADA treatment targets, are in a safe place with their diabetes. That means they have their blood sugars, their A1C under 7.0%, they're reaching blood pressure goals, and they're reaching cholesterol goals, especially LDL cholesterol goals, or lousy cholesterol. So only 28% of folks are there. So if you're not, remember again, you're in the majority. 72% of people are not really in a safe place with all of their diabetes numbers. So this is so common, and that's what we want to emphasize. The third thing I want to mention is this. If you really want to start freeing yourself from all this shaming and blaming, there's 2 other things to consider. One is we need to start thinking differently, and thinking differently in one particular way. So what's the most common thing? Well, the most common thing is this. You want to consider, stop asking yourself, why did this happen to me? What did I do wrong? Why is the universe punishing me for giving me this terrible disease? Instead, consider this. When those thoughts come to you, think about how you might speak to yourself differently. You could start by asking yourself a very different question, which is, what now? And this is really the difference between what we call emotion-focused coping when a problem arises versus problem-focused coping. That it's very easy for all of us to fall into this, again, shaming and blaming. Why did this happen to me? What did I do wrong? It's all my fault. to put that aside, at least for a few moments, and start thinking about, okay, well, that's maybe the past, true or not. What about now? What now? What action can I take now to make a difference? This is a great way to regain some control over yourself, over life, and move forward so that you can live a longer and healthier life with type 2 diabetes. We also want to consider how this works, not just when we think about diabetes, but more broadly. Maybe you're struggling with your weight. So consider this example. Here's someone who makes the point of weighing themselves every day. And when that number on your bathroom scale disappoints you tomorrow morning, instead of saying, ugh, what did I do wrong? Think about asking yourself this. Okay, that number's not great. What am I going to do now about this? What am I going to do differently today? And it's something this simple, but just beginning to challenge how you typically think about things and introducing new ways that can make a big difference so that you can feel more in control. And finally, the last solution I want to mention to you is this. It's important to consider how we address not how we just think about diabetes ourselves and deal with this embarrassment and shame, but how do we address the blamers and shamers in our life? So let me give you an example. And this comes from a blog written several years ago online from Elizabeth Snoofer at diabetesvoice.org. I've abbreviated this because it was too much to put on one slide, but it gives you a sense of what she had to say. Let's read this together. She said this, the eye doctor did not address me by name or say hello when I walked into his office. Instead, looking at the photos of my retina, he yelled and ranted. You have proliferative retinopathy. Your eyes will blow any day. What have you done to yourself? If you don't do what I say, you'll soon be blind. I was terrified, but I stood up anyway and told him to leave and get a manager. He left, and I never saw or heard from him again. I'm confident that I'm not the first person this doctor mistreated, but I do believe I was the first person who spoke up. Now, this eye doctor probably meant well. He was trying to figure out some way he could be of help. But really, all this effort to just scare the bejesus out of this gal and then to really blame her for what had occurred is, again, the evidence is lacking that makes any sense at all, nor is it likely to be of any help at all. So the message about that is to consider this. I know you want the best for me. Think about this next time this ever happens with a healthcare provider, and think about feeling assertive enough to say, I know you want the best for me, but trying to scare me or blame me actually isn't helpful to me. We could talk about perhaps how you could help me, what we could do that could make a difference for me, but the blaming and shaming usually just makes me want to hide. And then there's what to do about, of course, the diabetes police. What about when people are blaming you for your diabetes, looking at you funny? Well, of course, I've spoken a lot about this, and there's a lot written about this subject, but the most important thing we want to remember that your diabetes policemen in your life mean well. They're trying to be helpful, even though they're driving you crazy. So the ideal thing is you want to find a dispassionate moment, not when everybody's really angry, and again, use the same approach. I understand you're trying to help, but what you're doing is actually not that helpful. And to give them new ideas about what they do that actually would help you and could be supportive of you without necessarily being blaming. And if you need help with this, you may be familiar that we at the Behavioral Diabetes Institute have a little booklet you can download. It's completely free, and it's the Diabetes Etiquette Card. And this etiquette card is for people who don't have diabetes. So next time one of your diabetes policemen says something annoying to you that is, again, blaming you or shaming you, you can just very politely say, oh, I guess you don't know the rules about how to behave. And you hand them a little diabetes etiquette card. There's actually 10 diabetes etiquette points. And it's designed to be at least somewhat humorous as a way to begin to open a conversation with them, to ask them to begin to think differently about type 2 diabetes and about how they could work together with you that could make a positive difference instead of trying to make things, well, seemingly worse. Again, you can download these for free, although online, if you download them, they'll just be on a one-sheet paper, but you can find them at our website, behavioraldiabetes.org. So here are the 4 solutions. You want to get the facts, and the most important fact, of course, is diabetes is not your fault. Honest to goodness, the evidence is very clear. There's all these important external factors. And that you're not alone if you're feeling uncomfortable and feeling embarrassed and ashamed about diabetes. That it's super common. And that we put forward a couple ideas about how to start thinking differently. Remember, the most important one is when you find yourself blaming yourself, to think instead by saying, well, what do I want to do about this right now? You can regain control and make a difference to help you live a long and healthy life. And we've talked about some ideas about how to address those blamers and shamers in your life. Well, that can be pretty difficult. So I hope this is helpful. I want to thank you all for listening and look forward to being able to talk with you again another time. Thanks.